The marketplace of Settlement Omega-7 bustled with activity as vendors hawked their wares under the dual suns of the Centauri system. For most, it was just another trading day in the frontier colony. For Nalia, it was the difference between her child's survival and starvation. Her four-fingered hands trembled as she surveyed the food stalls. The luminescent markings on her blue-tinted skin were dim, a sign of severe malnutrition among her species. She pulled her tattered hood lower, concealing the delicate gill-like structures along her neck that would immediately identify her as a Lysanian, an unwelcome refugee in this human-dominated outpost. Just this once, she whispered to herself in her native tongue, a series of melodic clicks that would sound alien to human ears. Just enough for Tellen to eat. Her child, barely 6 cycles old, lay feverish in their makeshift shelter on the colony's outskirts. The protein supplements they'd been surviving on had run out 3 days ago, and Tellen's immune system, already compromised from the radiation exposure during their escape from their war-torn homeworld, was failing. Nalia approached a stall with fresh hydroponically grown vegetables and sealed protein packs. The merchant, a burly human with a thick beard, was busy haggling with another customer. With practiced stealth, a skill learned during the long war on Lysania, she slipped 2 protein packs into the folds of her garment. She had almost made it away when a firm hand gripped her wrist. "I saw that," said a deep voice. Nalia froze, her heart racing. Being caught stealing meant imprisonment or worse, deportation back to Lysania, a death sentence for both her and Tellen. She turned to face her captor, expecting to see security forces. Instead, she met the stern gaze of another human merchant. His eyes were a startling green against his tan skin, and his dark hair was tied back neatly. "Please," she said in halting standard. "My child, sick, hungry." The man, Darian Voss, had seen many thieves in his decade-running cargo between frontier settlements. Most were opportunists or addicts. But something in this alien woman's desperate eyes gave him pause. The way her hands shook wasn't from guilt but from fear and hunger. "Security doesn't take kindly to thieves," he said, maintaining his grip but not calling for the guards. "Even desperate ones." "I know punishment," she replied, her translator device struggling with her accent. "But my son will die without food. Do what you must to me." Darian glanced around. No one was paying them much attention in the busy marketplace. He made a decision that would change both their lives. "Come with me," he said, releasing her wrist but staying close. "Not to security." Nalia hesitated, clutching the stolen goods. Every instinct told her to run, but where would she go? The colony was surrounded by uninhabitable terrain, and she had no way off planet. Darian led her to his own stall, where crates of imported goods from various systems were neatly arranged. He gestured for her to sit on a crate behind the counter, out of sight from casual observers. "Eat," he said, pushing a container of proper food toward her. "Then we'll talk." Suspicion warred with desperation on her face. "Why help thief? Trick?" Darian shook his head. "No trick. I've seen what happens to those caught stealing. The punishment doesn't fit the crime, especially not when it's for survival." Still wary, Nalia began to eat, saving half of everything in a small pouch. "For your child?" Darian asked. She nodded, her luminescent markings pulsing slightly brighter as she consumed the nutrients her body desperately needed. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "Abandoned storage unit. Section D-12, she answered hesitantly. "Not supposed to be there." Darian nodded. The outer sections were poorly monitored, harsh living conditions but safer for undocumented refugees. "I need help in my shop," he said finally. "Loading, inventory, cleaning. It pays enough for food and maybe better shelter. Interested?" Nalia stared at him. In her experience, humans didn't offer jobs to illegal Lysanian refugees. They reported them. Why would you trust me? I tried to steal from you. You tried to feed your child, he corrected. There's a difference. Besides, I'd rather have someone indebted to me than see another desperate person thrown into the system. For the first time in months, something like hope flickered in Nalia's chest. My son, Tellan, he is very sick. We'll see what can be done about that too, Darian said. Now, what's your name? Nalia, she said, the bioluminescent patterns on her skin brightening slightly. Nalia Krdath. Darian Voss, he replied with a small smile. Looks like you just found yourself a job, Nalia Krdath. As the dual suns began to set, casting long shadows across the marketplace, Nalia realized this human had just offered her something she hadn't dared hope for since fleeing Lysania, a chance. The early morning light filtered through the patched skylight of Darian's shop as Nalia organized inventory. 2 weeks had passed since their encounter in the marketplace, and she was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. In her experience, kindness always came with hidden costs. You're here early, Darian said, entering with 2 steaming cups. He handed her one filled with a sweet-smelling purple liquid, a Lysanian tea he'd specially ordered. Tellan slept through the night, she explained, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. First time since we arrived on this planet. The medical supplements Darian had procured were working. Her son's fever had broken, and the bluish tint had returned to his skin. The memory of Darian's face when he'd first seen Tellan, small, frail, but with determined eyes, still puzzled her. Instead of disgust at the child's alien features, she'd seen only concern. The shipping manifest came in, Darian said, scrolling through his datapad. We've got a big delivery coming from the Arcturus sector. Mostly mechanical parts, but, he paused, smiling, I added a few specialty items. He showed her the list, and her luminescent markings pulsed brightly, a Lysanian expression of surprise. Among the items were children's education modules compatible with Lysanian neural patterns and nutrient supplements formulated specifically for her species. These are expensive, she said, her translator struggling to convey her emotion. Why would you? Consider it an investment, Darian replied. Tellan deserves an education, regardless of where he was born. As they worked together unloading cargo later that day, Nalia noticed the stares from passers-by. Some were merely curious, but others held undisguised hostility. They don't like seeing you employ an alien, she observed quietly as a man spat on the ground near the shop entrance. Darian shrugged. Their opinions aren't my concern. But Nalia knew better. She'd overheard conversations, seen the decline in certain customers. Humans from the military sector especially avoided the shop now. Settlement Omega-7 had taken in refugees after the Lysanian Civil War as a diplomatic gesture, but integration had been minimal at best. My people's biology fascinates some of your scientists, she said as they ate lunch in the small apartment above the shop where Darian had insisted she and Tellan stay. But most humans see us as competition for resources. Tellan sat on the floor nearby, engrossed in a holographic puzzle Darian had given him. His recovery was remarkable. Children of her species were resilient if given proper nutrition and care. Tell me about Lysania, Darian said, watching the child. What was your life like before? Nalia's markings dimmed slightly, a sign of sadness. I was a botanical engineer. I developed hydroponic systems to grow food in our underground cities after the surface was contaminated. So you know about plants? Darian's eyes lit up. That's perfect. I've been trying to cultivate some rare herbs in the back greenhouse, but they keep dying. Later that afternoon, Nalia examined the struggling plants, her four-fingered hands gently probing the soil. Too much acidity, she diagnosed. And the light spectrum is wrong for these species. Darian watched as she adjusted settings and mixed minerals into the soil with practiced ease. You're full of surprises, Nalia Krdath. Her skin flushed a deeper blue, the Lysanian equivalent of a blush. I never thought my skills would be useful here. As days turned into weeks, Nalia's expertise transformed the small greenhouse into a thriving garden. Rare herbs and vegetables that Darien had been importing at great expense now grew abundantly under her care. The profit margins of the shop improved substantially. But not everyone was pleased with their success. Rallen Mercer, owner of the largest import business in the settlement, watched with growing displeasure as customers were drawn to Darien's fresh produce. "You're keeping dangerous company, Voss," Mercer warned during a suppliers' meeting. "Those Lysanians brought their war here. They can't be trusted." "Nalia's not a soldier," Darien countered. "She's a refugee trying to build a life for her child." Mercer's eyes narrowed. "There are rumors about those aliens. Their biology, their abilities. Some say they can influence human emotions through those glowing patterns on their skin." Darien laughed. "Those patterns are just expressions, like our facial movements." "Be careful," Mercer said, lowering his voice. "The Settlement Security Council is reviewing the refugee policy. Things are changing." That evening, as Tellan slept soundly in the small bedroom Darien had cleared for them, Nalia found her employer, no, her friend, staring at the settlement's distant lights from the rooftop garden. "You're troubled," she said, joining him. "Just thinking," he replied. "Did you know I was a military engineer before opening this shop? I saw enough conflict to last several lifetimes." Nalia's markings pulsed with interest. "Why did you leave?" "I wanted to build things that helped people, not destroyed them." He turned to her, his expression serious. "The settlement's getting restless about the refugee situation. I might have made you a target by being so visible." "You made us visible by showing kindness," she corrected. "My people believe that compassion is the highest form of intelligence." Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. In that moment, the vast differences between their species seemed to fade against the backdrop of the star-filled sky. "You've transformed this place," Darien said softly, gesturing to the lush garden around them. "Not just with your botanical knowledge." Nalia reached out, hesitantly placing her four-fingered hand over his five. "And you've transformed our lives." As the night deepened around them, neither moved away. The bridge between their worlds, begun with an act of desperation and compassion in a busy marketplace, grew stronger under the alien stars. The marketplace was unusually quiet for midday. Nalia noticed the tension as she arranged exotic fruits in the display case of what customers now called Voss and Kirdath imports. Her name on the recently painted sign still surprised her each morning. "Something's happening," she murmured to Darien as he returned from a meeting with suppliers. The luminescent patterns on her forearms pulsed with anxiety. "The Settlement Council passed new regulations last night," Darien confirmed, his voice low. "All non-humans must now register their biometric data and movements. They're calling it a security measure." Tellan emerged from the back room where he'd been studying. At 8 cycles old, he was growing stronger daily, his English now nearly perfect thanks to the education modules. "Is it because of the incident at the spaceport?" he asked. 3 days earlier, a cargo ship had been damaged in what officials called a refugee protest gone wrong. Witnesses told different stories, but the damage was done, fear was spreading through the colony. "People are scared of what they don't understand," Darien said, ruffling Tellan's headcrest affectionately. "Our job is to help them understand." A sharp knock interrupted them. Rallen Mercer stood at the door with 2 settlement security officers. "Inspection time," Mercer announced with poorly concealed satisfaction. "New regulations require verification of all alien-sourced products for potential biotoxins." Darien stepped forward. "Our permits are in order." "There's no legal basis." "Actually, there is," Mercer interrupted, presenting a document on his datapad. "Signed this morning." Any business with non-human partners is subject to enhanced scrutiny. The officers began methodically examining the greenhouse plants, taking samples and scanning with handheld devices. Nalia stood perfectly still, her markings dimmed to near invisibility, a Lysanian response to threat. Tellan moved closer to her, his small hand finding hers. "They're hurting the seedlings," he whispered as an officer roughly pulled up a delicate sprout. The inspection lasted 2 hours. They found nothing, but the damage to the greenhouse was significant. Weeks of careful cultivation destroyed in an afternoon. After they left, Darian kicked over an empty crate in frustration. "This isn't about security. It's about driving out competition and scapegoating refugees." That evening, as they worked to salvage what they could of the greenhouse, Nalia made a decision. "We should leave, Darian," she said quietly. "Return to the refugee sector. Your business is suffering because of us." Darian straightened, soil smudged across his cheek. "This is your business too. And this is your home. Is it?" Her voice wavered. "Look at what's happening. The new regulations, the inspections. It will only get worse. Then we fight it," he insisted. "Together." Later, after Tellan was asleep, they sat on the rooftop garden under the stars. The settlement's lights seemed colder now, more threatening. "On Lysania," Nalia said softly, "we have a ceremony called the light sharing. When two people form a bond, they exchange personal illumination patterns." She extended her arm, where the bioluminescent markings glowed in a complex, beautiful sequence. "It's beautiful," Darian said, watching the light dance across her blue skin. "It's more than decoration. It's language, emotion, connection." She hesitated. "I've never shown anyone here my true patterns." Slowly, deliberately, the markings on her skin began to pulse in a different rhythm, deeper, more complex. The light shifted through colors he hadn't seen before. "This is me," she said simply. "Not the refugee. Not the alien. Just Nalia." Darian reached out, his fingers hovering above the glowing patterns. "May I?" She nodded, and he gently traced the luminescence. Where his fingers touched, the patterns brightened and swirled, responding to him. "They recognize you," she whispered, surprised. The distance between them closed, hesitantly at first, then with growing certainty. His lips found hers in the darkness, different in texture and temperature, yet perfectly matched. The bioluminescent patterns on her skin flared brilliantly, casting their intertwined shadows against the greenhouse glass. When they finally parted, Darian kept his hands on her shoulders. "I'm not letting anyone drive you away," he said firmly. "Not Mercer, not the council, no one." A noise from the stairwell interrupted them. Tellan stood there, eyes wide. "The patterns," he said, pointing to his mother's still glowing skin. "They're the bonding lights. The ones from the old stories." Nalia knelt before her son. "Does that trouble you?" Tellan considered this with the directness only a child could manage. "No," he decided. "Darian makes the darkness go away. Like in the stories." The next morning brought news that chilled them all. The settlement council had scheduled a vote on a measure to relocate all non-human refugees to a monitored compound outside the main colony. For their protection, the announcement claimed. Darian's fist came down hard on the counter. "This ends now." He spent the day making calls to contacts from his military days, speaking with other merchants, gathering information. By evening, he had a plan. "The council needs to see that we're not backing down," he told Nalia as they closed the shop. "They need to understand that this colony was built by different species working together." "What are you suggesting?" Nalia asked, her markings pulsing with concern. "A demonstration. Peaceful but powerful. Every business that works with non-humans, every family with mixed species, everyone who believes in what we're building here, all of us, together, showing the council what this settlement really stands for. Nalia touched his face, her cool fingers tracing the line of his jaw. They could take everything from you. They already tried to take what matters most, he replied, covering her hand with his own. And I won't let them. As night fell over settlement Omega-7, plans spread through secure channels. The rising shadows that had threatened to engulf them would soon face the light of defiance, and perhaps, understanding. Dawn broke over settlement Omega-7 with an unsettling quiet. The marketplace, usually bustling with early traders, remained shuttered and still. Only the security patrols moved through the streets, their uniforms stark against the colony's utilitarian architecture. In the apartment above their shop, Darian and Nalia made final preparations. The demonstration was set for midday, when the council would be voting on the relocation measure. Is this truly wise? Nalia asked, her luminescent markings pulsing with anxiety as she packed emergency supplies into a small bag. Her people had learned the hard way that protest often led to reprisal. Darian looked up from the communication device he was programming. Sometimes the only choice is to stand your ground. And sometimes surviving is victory enough, she countered, glancing at Tellan who was quietly reading in the corner, trying to appear brave despite his obvious fear. A sharp knock at the door silenced them. Darian motioned for Nalia and Tellan to move to the hidden storage space they'd prepared, a precaution that now seemed prescient. To his surprise, the visitor wasn't security but Evelyn Reeves, a council member he'd served with in the military years ago. You shouldn't be here, Evelyn, Darian said, checking the street for observers before letting her in. Neither should you, if you're planning what I think you are. Her eyes darted to the preparations visible around the apartment. The vote's been moved up. It's happening now, and Mercer has security on high alert. Nalia emerged from hiding, recognizing the council insignia on Evelyn's jacket. Then we've already lost. Evelyn shook her head. Not necessarily. The council is split. Some of us see this for what it is, fear-mongering and profiteering disguised as security. How many? Darian asked, hope kindling. Enough to make a difference, if we had evidence of integration success. Stories that counter Mercer's narrative of dangerous aliens exploiting human generosity. Darian and Nalia exchanged glances. What kind of evidence? Documented cases of human-alien cooperation. Economic data showing benefits of integration. Medical research on cross-species compatibility. Evelyn's expression softened as she noticed Tellan peering cautiously from his hiding place. And testimonials, especially from children. They're harder to dismiss as political. The plan shifted rapidly. Instead of a demonstration that would likely end in arrests, they would stage something more powerful, a truth campaign. Within hours, Darian had activated his network. Mixed-species families and business partners gathered at designated locations, documenting their stories. A sympathetic journalist began broadcasting interviews. Medical professionals released data on successful treatments across species. At the council chambers, proceedings halted as screens around the room lit up with these transmissions. Citizens filled the public gallery, demanding to be heard. Mercer slammed his fist on the table. This is a security matter, not a public referendum. Security is built on trust, not fear, Evelyn countered, signaling for Darian to enter. He walked into the chambers with Nalia and Tellan beside him, their heads held high despite the murmurs that rippled through the room. Several council members visibly recoiled at the sight of Lysanians in their sacred chambers. Members of the council, Darian began, his voice steady. 3 weeks ago, a hungry refugee stole food from my stall. By your proposed laws, she should have been imprisoned or deported. He gestured to his thriving business displayed on the screens. Instead, she became my partner in a venture that's increased trade revenue by 40%. Her botanical knowledge has allowed us to grow species previously thought impossible in our biosphere. Nalia stepped forward, her markings pulsing with a calm determination that many humans in the room had never witnessed, the Lysanian expression of dignity and resolve. "I came to this settlement with nothing but my child and the clothes I wore," she said, her translator rendering her musical language into clear standard. "I was prepared to die on your streets rather than return to a war zone. Instead, I found something I thought extinct in the universe: compassion." Tellen moved to stand between them, taking one hand from each. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. "The measure before you claims to protect humans from alien influence," Darian continued. "But look around you. The most dangerous influence in any society isn't the stranger seeking shelter, it's fear." Mercer rose to his feet. "This emotional display doesn't change the facts. The incident at the spaceport was instigated by hired mercenaries," interrupted a new voice. A security officer stepped forward, presenting evidence on her datapad. "We've been investigating the explosion. The perpetrators were hired by someone with significant financial interest in segregating the settlement." All eyes turned to Mercer, whose face had drained of color. What followed was chaos, accusations, revelations, secret financial records exposed. By evening, the voting on the measure had been postponed indefinitely, and Mercer was being escorted to the detention center for questioning. As they walked home through streets now filled with cautiously optimistic citizens, both human and non-human, Nalia's hand found Darian's. "You risked everything today," she said quietly. "Your business, your standing, everything you've built here." Darian stopped, turning to face her under the light of the setting suns. "No. I protected everything that matters." In the privacy of their home, with Tellen finally sleeping peacefully in his room, they held each other close. The luminescent patterns on Nalia's skin glowed with an intensity that transformed the simple apartment into a cathedral of light. "My people have a saying," she whispered against his chest. "The darkest night reveals the brightest stars." Darian's hand traced the patterns on her arm, watching as they responded to his touch. "And what do your people say about humans who fall in love with Lysanians?" Her markings pulsed in a pattern he'd come to recognize as joy. "They say such humans have seen beyond the surface to the true light beneath." Their kiss deepened, differences in biology forgotten in the universal language of desire. As clothing fell away, the patterns on her skin revealed themselves fully, covering her torso, her back, her thighs in swirling constellations of bioluminescence that responded to his every touch with flares of color and light. "I've never," she began. "With a human," he finished. She nodded, suddenly shy despite their intimacy. "We'll learn together," he promised. And they did, discovering each other with gentle curiosity that gave way to passionate certainty. Her cooler skin against his warmth, his 5 fingers intertwining with her 4, differences that created perfect harmony rather than discord. Later, as they lay together in the darkness made brilliant by the afterglow of her markings, Darian made a decision. "Whatever happens next," he said, "we face it as a family. You, me, and Tellen." Nalia's response was to intensify the light patterns between them, creating a bond visible to any who knew how to see. Outside their window, the settlement continued its uneasy evolution. The battle wasn't over, prejudice never died in a single day. But something had shifted, a choice made not just by them but by enough people to matter. A choice to see beyond differences to the light beneath. Morning light filtered through the newly installed stained glass window of what the settlement now officially called Harmony Botanicals. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the council chambers. The changes that followed hadn't come easily, but they had come. Nalia moved efficiently among the expanded greenhouse beds, her 4-fingered hands gently testing the soil moisture of the rarest specimens. The luminescent patterns on her skin glowed with contentment as she worked, no longer hidden but displayed proudly in the now famous botanical garden that drew visitors from across the colony. "The Terran nightshade is flowering again," she called to Darien, who was adjusting the atmospheric controls at the far end of the greenhouse. "2 blooms this cycle." He crossed the garden to stand beside her, admiring the delicate purple blossoms. "That's unheard of. Even on Earth they only bloom once a year. They respond to the harmonic resonance patterns," she explained, allowing her skin's bioluminescence to pulse in a specific rhythm. The flowers seem to tremble slightly in response. Life recognizes life, regardless of its origin. The door chime sounded, and Tellen burst in from his morning lessons, his young face alight with excitement. At his side walked Evelyn Reeves, now head of the newly formed Integration Commission. "We received approval," Tellen announced, holding up a data crystal. "Every classroom will have the new xenobiology curriculum by next semester." Evelyn nodded, smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. The council voted unanimously. "Your mother's botanical research was the deciding factor, along with the medical applications Dr. Fenris discovered." Nalia's markings pulsed with pride. The healing properties of certain Lysanian Earth hybrid plants she'd developed had proven remarkably effective against colonial respiratory diseases. What had begun as a simple greenhouse experiment was now changing medicine throughout the settlement. "There's more news," Evelyn continued, her expression growing serious. "We've received word from the central government. They're sending representatives to evaluate our integration program as a possible model for other frontier colonies." Darien exchanged glances with Nalia. This was bigger than their small family, bigger even than Settlement Omega-7. This could change policies across human space. "When do they arrive?" he asked. "Next week. And they've specifically requested to meet with both of you." Evelyn paused. "There's been another development. The peace talks on Lysania have progressed. Your homeworld is stabilizing, Nalia." The news hit her like a physical force. For years, she'd accepted that she would never see her homeworld again. Her luminescent patterns flickered with complex emotions, hope, uncertainty, longing. "You could go home," Darien said softly, reading her expression. "Both of you." Tellen looked up sharply. "But this is our home now." Later that evening, after Evelyn had left with promises of official documentation, they sat on their rooftop garden beneath the stars. The settlement spread before them, its lights mingling with the bioluminescent plants Nalia had introduced to the colony's architecture, a visible symbol of integration. "Would you want to return?" Darien asked finally, breaking the silence that had grown between them since Evelyn's news. "To Lysania?" Nalia's patterns shifted thoughtfully. "I want Tellen to know his heritage, to see the crystal forests and the singing caverns." "But..." Her four-fingered hand found his. "My home is here now." Relief washed through him. "We could visit, when it's safe. Cultural exchange. Part of our work." "Our work," she repeated, smiling. "From thieves to ambassadors. The universe has strange patterns." Darien pulled her closer. "Speaking of patterns." The luminescence on her skin brightened in response to his touch, swirling in the now familiar signals of desire. They had learned each other's bodies thoroughly in the months since their first night together, the initial awkwardness of biological differences giving way to a deep understanding of what pleased each other. "Tellen is staying with his friend Marco tonight," she reminded him, her musical voice dropping to a tone that sent pleasant shivers down his spine. Beneath the stars, they celebrated their journey in the most ancient way possible. Her cooler skin against his heat, the bioluminescence painting their intertwined bodies in ethereal light, their differences creating perfect harmony rather than discord. Later, as they lay together, Darien traced the patterns on her shoulder. "I have something for you," he said, reaching for a small box he'd hidden earlier. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet inlaid with photoreactive crystals that captured and echoed the patterns of her skin's luminescence. "It's a tradition on Earth," he explained. "A token of commitment." "We have a similar tradition," she said softly, reaching into a pouch near the bed. She withdrew a small vial of glowing liquid. "Essence of our personal light patterns, exchanged between life bonds." With gentle precision, she painted a small pattern on his wrist with the luminescent fluid. Unlike regular paint, it seemed to sink into his skin, leaving a faint glow that pulsed in time with her own markings. "It only bonds with those who are truly connected," she explained. "It will fade within days on anyone else." Darian watched, fascinated, as the pattern brightened. "And on me? If our connection is true, it will become permanent. A visible sign of our bond that any Lysanian would recognize." The next morning brought a flurry of activity as preparations began for the government representative's visit. Darian found himself in meetings with the council, planning presentations and tours, while Nalia coordinated with other refugee leaders to showcase successful integration stories. A week later, as the official delegation's ship descended through the atmosphere, Darian, Nalia, and Tellan stood with the welcoming committee. The luminescent pattern on Darian's wrist, now a permanent mark, pulsed in time with Nalia's own light, visible evidence of their bond. The ship's ramp lowered, and the officials emerged, stern-faced bureaucrats with data pads and security details. Among them, to Nalia's shock, was a Lysanian diplomat, the first of her kind to hold such a position in human space. "Welcome to Settlement Omega-7, Evelyn began the formal greeting. "Where we've discovered that our differences are not obstacles but opportunities." As the tour progressed through the transformed settlement, the visitors witnessed what many had considered impossible: humans and aliens working together not just as reluctant neighbors but as partners, friends, and in some cases, family. In the botanical gardens, the government officials marveled at the hybrid plants that were revolutionizing colonial medicine. In the schools, they observed children of different species learning side by side. In the marketplace, they saw commerce thriving across species boundaries. "Impressive," the lead representative admitted during the final briefing. "But is it sustainable? Or is this merely a short-term experiment?" Darian and Nalia exchanged glances before she stepped forward, her luminescence bright and confident. "When I first came to this settlement, I was starving, desperate, ready to risk imprisonment to feed my child." Her voice carried clearly through the chamber. "I had known only struggle and rejection since fleeing my homeworld." She gestured to the prosperous greenhouse around them. "Now I lead research that benefits all species in the colony. My son studies in your schools and dreams of becoming a xenobiologist. And I have found a partner," she glanced at Darian, "who sees beyond difference to possibility." The Lysanian diplomat's markings pulsed with recognition as she noticed the matching patterns on Nalia and Darian's wrists. "A true life bond," she murmured in their native tongue. "Unprecedented. This is not just sustainable," Darian concluded. "It's the only viable future for all our species. Not assimilation, not segregation, but true integration, where each contributes their unique strengths and perspectives." The next morning, as the delegation prepared to depart, the lead representative presented them with official documentation. Settlement Omega-7 had been designated a model integration zone, with increased funding and authority to expand their programs. More importantly, they brought news that would change everything. A formal peace treaty had been signed on Lysania, ending decades of civil war. Reconstruction was beginning, and skilled expatriates like Nalia were being invited to return to help rebuild, with guarantees of safety for themselves and their families, regardless of species. "You could be a bridge between our worlds," the Lysanian diplomat told her. "Your family represents what's possible." As the delegation's ship rose into the morning sky, Darian, Nalia, and Tellan stood hand in hand on the observation deck. Before them lay choices that would have seemed impossible when Nalia first stole food in a desperate act of survival. "What do you think?" Darian asked, feeling the pulse of her emotions through the luminescent bond on his wrist. Nalia looked between her son and her partner, her markings glowing with a complex pattern of hope and certainty. "I think," she said, "that where there is compassion, there are always new horizons." Above them, the dual suns of Centauri bathed the settlement in golden light, illuminating a world forever changed by one simple choice, to see beyond differences to the shared light within.